All right, are we ready to roll? Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us today for this plenary, More Than Words, Learning from Australia's COVID-19 Communication for Multicultural Engagement with Katarina Woolf. My name is Lauren Gorfinkel. I'm a senior lecturer in international communications at Macquarie University and a proud member of the Multilingualism Research Centre. And I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of country by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the Macquarie University land, the Wadawurrung clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since the dream time. We pay our respects to elders, past, present, and future. Now, before I introduce Katarina, we have a quick message about the program from Chloe.
Yes, thank you very much, Lauren. So just a quick message from me. We've just had 2 changes to our program. So we have a talk on at 9 p.m. tonight from Thi Phuong Lan Nguyen, so curriculum and standards of linguistic and cultural knowledge skills. And so that could be a good one to go to and mingle with perhaps some people on the other side of the world as well, because it will be daytime for them. And we have another change as well tomorrow at 3:15 in room 1, Melbourne Stern's talk on sentence length restriction as a tool to teach writing will be on as well. So those are the 2 changes, and both of them are available on Sched. So if you want to just have another look through the ones you're interested in attending, then feel free to have a look on there. All right, thank you very much, everyone, and I'll pop back over to you, Lauren.
Thanks, Chloe. So I'll now introduce our plenary speaker, Katarina Woolf, who is an associate professor in Curtin University's School of Management and Marketing in Western Australia and the lead of the university's public relations program. So I've known Katarina for a few years now from her work with the Public Relations Institute of Australia. She leads up the education committee there, I think it was called. And we both teach public relations, and we're particularly concerned about multicultural PR and engaging with multicultural and multilingual communities in that communications sector, and also diversity within the sector. I use some of her publications as texts for my students. So yeah, a great one to have on board. So really excited to have Katarina speak with us today. So Katarina is passionate about cross-cultural public interest and inclusive communication, and recognises different stakeholders, groups' unique needs and priorities. And she draws on 20 years experience in the communication and media industries as an educator as well. And her experience spans research and communication roles in Germany, Spain, the United Kingdom, and Australia. So I'm going to invite Katarina to speak for about 30-35 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions. If you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat box as we're going along, and we'll aim to get to those at the end. And also just wanted to mention that following on from this plenary, we have a symposium which also includes Katarina as well as myself and other further speakers on this very interesting topic about engaging with multilingual communities from a communications and arts perspective. So without further ado, welcome aboard, Katarina.
Thank you very much, Lauren, for the lovely welcome, and welcome everyone else. Bear with me, I'm sharing my screen, and I want to share screen 1, so hopefully you can see yourself, but only what I actually want to share. I'm really hoping that as a result of my talk today, we're going to have more of a discussion. So I'm really hoping we're going to have less questions, more of a discussion. And that's what I'm really looking forward to and I'm really interested in. So, yeah, so welcome to my plenary. As Lauren said, it's titled More Than Words, Learning from Australia's COVID-19 Communication for Multicultural Engagement. My aim really here is not to provide any definite answers, but rather to ask some questions and to encourage further debate and discussion, and hopefully therefore leading to more of an audience-centered response during future pandemics, hopefully not too near in the future, but you never know. and really the recognition of a multicultural or the multicultural community's unique needs beyond language requirements in the future. So seeing language as an important core of it, but going beyond that as well. Many of the points raised will be, as Lauren just flagged, will be further discussed and explored in detail as part of the following symposium. So I see this as a kind of like a promotion section really for the symposium coming up, where we're going to go into more detail into some of the case studies I'm referencing there as well, especially with the focus on the Melbourne and Sydney lockdowns. But before I start, I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I work and live, and that's the Whadjuk Noongar people. And I would like to acknowledge and show my respect for their elders past, present and emerging, and for their continuing culture and contributions they make to the life of our country, both now and in the past. So where do I start? Australia positions itself as a very proud, multicultural and successful multicultural society. It is recognised as one of the most multicultural societies on earth. Indeed, former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull argued Australia is the most successful multicultural society in the world, and there might be some challenges out there. But this is basically how we represent ourselves, how we identify ourselves. That's who we are. And as most of you would be aware, according to the latest data available through the Australian Bureau of Statistics, nearly half of Australians were either born overseas, which includes me. So first generation Australians or one or both parents were born overseas. So at the time of the 2016 census, more than 300 different languages were spoken in Australian homes, with more than 1/5 of Australians speaking a language other than English at home. The global pandemic has really motivated me to proactively explore the notion of multiculturalism, to somewhat challenge Australia's multicultural identity within this context of a health emergency. So we know that one of the key challenges in managing an unfolding global pandemic has been Australia's limited previous exposure to viruses that have wreaked havoc in other parts of the world, such as SARS, HIV, AIDS. We've been largely protected, but what we failed to do is to actually learn from those painful experiences that our neighbours have gone through and gain those future-proofing insights that actually would have helped us to hit the ground running much earlier. Communication or even the marketing often appears to be limited to an allocation of a dollar figure, with limited critical consideration of how we should actually engage with the broader public, and more importantly, how we should engage with the diverse population that is not necessarily easily serviced by a generic ad, which we seem to be fascinated with, the whole idea of an ad, and I'll come back to that later on. And where individuals and their associated cultural groups are recognised as having unique concerns and needs. So I'll explore this as part of this plenary, but I'm also, as I'm encouraging in particular public communicators, but by extension, really all of us, to think beyond language as spoken and written words and consequent translations. There is so much more that makes us unique and brings us all together and can assist us in addressing future health emergencies more successfully. On that note, I also, what I always find fascinating when we talk about multiculturalism, quite often we forget that Australia is home to the world's oldest continuous cultures. And they're quite often actually overlooked when we talk about multiculturalism. So Australian Aboriginal culture is a key element of our outward-looking identity. If you're thinking about tourism, there's that nostalgic kind of romanticised notion of Indigenous Australia, which it is part of our identity and who we really are and how we demonstrate ourselves outside. And I'm actually quite excited to see that more and more represented in the school curriculum, although flagging that my kids' primary school main language is still Italian, which I find somewhat baffling, I have to admit. Right, so I'd also like to disclose where I'm coming from and who I am. So how is my thinking shaped and shaping my understanding of multiculturalism and multilingualism? I'm a first generation Australian and therefore I'm looking at multiculturalism nevertheless through a particular lens, most notably through a white Germanic lens, which is somewhat rose-coloured by my access to healthcare, other support services, and most importantly, education. I've come here with my husband out of my free will. It's taken me a long time personally to actually recognise that I have some sort of a blind spot when it comes to certain elements of multiculturalism and diversity. Indeed, there are those spots I've previously kind of assumed I could label as characteristics of kind of openness, inclusive thinking. But indeed, they reflect a level of ignorance, as there's certain aspects of living in Australia as a representative of the CALP community that are simply not visible to me. And it's surprisingly, it's taken me quite a long time to fully acknowledge that. There's a level of culture blindness that's been afforded to me courtesy of my own cultural background and ethnicity. I've had the opportunity to learn English at school and to study, further improving my language skills. Most notably, I'm white. I don't stand out in the white Anglo-Celtic Australia, at least not until I open my mouth. But I've been afforded the opportunity to blend in, to be fairly invisible when I choose to be. And that's taken me a remarkably long time to actually acknowledge. Saying that, I spent my time at university as a mature age student in the UK, in the West Midlands. As a German, West Midlands at a university with the only remaining war studies degree in the UK. So I have encountered a fair share of racism as well, which has therefore kind of challenged the way I see the world and my role within it as well. So it's actually been quite eye-opening. I would also like to further disclose that my background is in culture studies as opposed to linguistics. Indeed, I now coordinate one of a small number of PR programs that's based in a business school, as opposed to humanities. So I've been a bit of a chameleon. I've been moving around a bit. However, as a communicator, I'm very much aware that language matters. But language also doesn't exist in isolation. It's a crucial part of our personal identity, in particular, the role our primary or first languages really play in this context. Right, and talking about this increased awareness, it's increasingly led me to the recognition that some cultures and ethnicities are more welcome than others and more embraced than others, beyond events like Harmony Day, when we really wheel out those traditional costumes. And don't get me wrong, I absolutely love Harmony Week. It's a beautiful time of the year. I also feel very much put on the spot because I'm one of the people without a traditional costume. So I feel very jealous of those people who have those beautiful ones. I normally have to wheel out my dad's soccer shirt he sent to the kids to wear, which isn't really quite the same. On that note, I'd like to, and there we come back to stereotypes. I'm from northwestern Germany, so I'm not Bavarian. I don't do Dienungs Lederhosen. That's a very specific thing, but it's kind of that notion of a stereotypical German that I have to really struggle with on and off as well. Being aware, as we're much aware, all is we all increasingly, and there's been a big shift, and I've certainly seen that in my own research when I was talking to first generation, second generation Australians working in communication, that there's been this huge shift in Australia, certainly becoming more open, certainly to international cuisine and what we really enjoy within that context. But for the remainder of the year, beyond Harmony Week, some cultures and languages are typically treated as more welcoming and acceptable and are more embraced than others. And this is really evidenced by the fact that Australia may legally have no official language, but the Department of Home Affairs makes it very clear that English is positioned as Australia's national language. And just to quote, for those who might not be familiar with this, people living in Australia should make an effort to learn English. It is important to learn to speak English because it helps to get an education, a job, and better integrate into the community. It is essential for economic participation and social cohesion, and Australian society values the English language as a national language of Australia and as an important unifying element of society. And for those of you in the audience that might have undergone recently a citizen test, this is something that's been certainly quizzed as part of the new Australian values that are being examined to become an Australian citizen. And of course, we've got that introduction of the language requirements. So what we've done, we've really emphasised English as a unifying element of Australian society, but we failed to recognise that beyond the focus on written and spoken words, there's also non-verbal communication and cultural differences that translate to platforms and preferences, and they're informed by different approaches to trust and expectations, and which are crucial to meaningful engagement, especially during an emergency situation. We also really failed to recognise that many migrants speak loads of different languages. For some reason, we give one language a higher value than all those others, which I always find rather puzzling within this context. Within the context of the pandemic, COVID-19 has really been framed as a virus that has originated overseas, and the news media keeps on emphasizing it. It's not our problem, it's a problem that comes from overseas, something we imported or we don't really like to import, and which is something we have to protect ourselves against. So Australia has been seeking to safeguard its interest and population by opting for isolation, effectively pulling up the drawbridges to the rest of the world. And Australia's COVID response success to date has been afforded arguably purely by its island status. Not many other countries have had the opportunity to entirely cut themselves off from the rest of the world. So the consequent isolation has resulted in othering or the marginalisation of people who are not part of that dominant social group. And what we have experienced in Australia over the past month is really not a new phenomenon. It's happened again and again throughout society. There are lots of examples in history, in particular in relation to communicable diseases and consequent outbreaks, starting with experiences during, let's say, the smallpox outbreak in the late 19th century, up to the Ebola pandemic at the start of the 21st century. So in times of uncertainty, humans have historically looked for scapegoats. And in groups, we create the other as a target of blame and to build boundaries between groups, stigmatizing migrants and other marginal groups as disease spreaders as such. So the others is framed as part of the problem by requiring additional attention, drawing on resources, or being effectively a part of the problem faced by a given society, in this case, the Australian society. And that's why I'm coming to cult communities. So it's illustrated by the quote on the previous slide by Dion and Turkman. Migrants and other marginal groups have historically been targets of blame and scapegoating during communicable disease outbreaks. In these times of uncertainty, we use scapegoating mechanisms to cope with the fear of the unknown. I think we can all relate to that. The last 2 years have been quite a challenging experience. It's that not knowing the end to it, and the related social, political, and economic consequences that come with that loss of control. Migrant communities have historically been seen as an easy target, resulting in future fragmentation of society as groups seek to marginalize others as disease breeders. And you see lots of examples of this blame shifting and finger pointing that's been explored certainly in more detail in the symposium following this plenary. So culturally and linguistically diverse communities have featured commonly in media reporting in relation to the global pandemic and its implications for Australian society. However, reporting has been dominated by this finger pointing and condemnation of multicultural communities, frequently singling out individuals from diverse cultural backgrounds as responsible for non-compliance and hence outbreaks of the virus locally and beyond. So there's this assumption of superiority, which has been represented in Australia's COVID response, in particular the assumption of having to tell people what to do. They don't listen, well, we send out the police on horseback. Alcohol consumption is increasing in lockdown areas, well, we control that by enforcing limits. We've seen entire tower blocks locked down again and again for prolonged periods of time, guarded by dedicated police and security, whilst Australian and neighbouring suburbs can come and go from their own house more or less at free will. So we've really witnessed that removal of personal agency for some, justified by an implied benefit of the greater good, which with rules that do not apply to the same extent to the already powerful elements of society. And that's why I'm arguing that we really need to look beyond language. Language is quite often used as an excuse for finger pointing, pointing out that people just don't understand. But the reason why people might not follow certain directives is far more complex than not understanding individual words. So it's those underlying challenges and sociocultural factors. For example, those larger households relying on the gig economy and casual work, the high percentage of essential workers in areas that have been hit by stricter lockdown measures, and so on, that play a crucial role in, for example, not being able to physically distance. Yes, so it's the othering, the blame game. So despite Australia proudly having this proud multicultural identity and telling everyone that's who we are, we're multicultural, we embrace everyone. And we've seen that increase in othering, which comes with fear, inclusion of some in our society ahead of others. And the other are people who are simply apparently not like us. The common narrative is that If they want to live here, well, they have to become more like us. And the question is, who is us within this context? And it sounds really familiar. At least we've seen this line repeated time and time again in the popular media, and especially so and increasingly so since the start of the global pandemic. Othering can be really thought of as an antonym of belonging, where belonging implies acceptance and inclusion of all people, and othering therefore suggests intolerance and exclusion. And what really puzzles me in this space is, you might recall at the very start of the pandemic, there was a lot of discussion around, this is going to change how we're going to work together as a society. It's going to bring us closer together. People are going to start to have community gardens. People are going to work more locally rather than go overseas. Well, there's been a huge shift and turnaround, and we've actually become a more fragmented society. As we look in really at that exacerbated threat of COVID, that's been framed as that threat from overseas. So I'm arguing that labeling of COVID or COVID-19 as a foreign virus in itself is problematic. It's been framed as something we need to protect ourselves against, as opposed to something we have to jointly combat. And that's really illustrated not just in Australia, but in the response by global leaders, where the race for vaccines has been won by the first world countries, while third world countries continue to miss out. And we see the impact of that right now with mutations. So the drive to protect ourselves against that external threat has driven us to disconnect from the rest of the world by pulling up those drawbridges and hiding ourselves in our self-imposed fortress. And that increases that fear of the other even more so. So we live in a society increasingly marked by conflict, which has been illustrated by territory and state leaders really competing against each other and publicly criticizing other responses, as opposed to working together, even at a national level, to collectively actually deal with that imposing threat. And we have a culture consequently of finger pointing as opposed to collaboration and collective decision making. And within this, we are looking for culprits. And unfortunately, it's a multicultural and especially the CAL community that presents a very easy target there, where we then see that some people can just go and hang out on a beach, whilst others can't even go to a funeral. So it's been certainly a very interesting time. So within that context, I've been very much following both the national and the state communication campaigns and the public information campaigns. That's my sense of coping with what's going on around me and trying to make sense of it. But I've also been collaborating with a colleague in New Zealand, which is very interesting, actually being able to compare notes and gaining an insight into how the two countries, which from the distance appear very similar, actually have very different approaches in how we deal with a global pandemic. So the COVID communication campaign at a federal level in particular is very much focused on message distribution. It's very much advertising driven, and a lot of you would be able to relate to that. There's been this obsession with getting the perfect ad. Look what Singapore's doing, look what the UK is doing. Let's get this perfect ad and it's going to fix everything. And this comes back to my earlier point that we're looking at allocating dollar values to something, but we don't actually look at what's the actual problem? What do we have to communicate? And how do we get it to the people where it really matters, rather than just running with an ad? And as someone who consumes the media excessively, I've managed to catch one of these ads once because I don't get the time to actually watch commercial television. So it's very much advertising driven, and it's the assumption that we can rely on mass communication channels. It's the being able to demonstrate we've done what we needed to do. Multicultural communities within this quite often conceptualized as monolithic. The whole idea of one size fits all, we need translations for stuff, not necessarily looking at beyond translations, what else do we actually need? And also, and we're going to talk about that later on, there's that limited focus on success indicators, as everyone is learning as we go along. What does success look like? What do we want people to do with those messages? That's quite often missing as we constantly trying to reinvent ourselves in response to the ever-evolving virus. But what we are now looking at is in Australia, as a lucky country in which some of us are simply luckier than others. And I'm having that conversation even at a local level, you know, when once the schools close down and everyone has to stay at home, there are those lucky few who've got the big backyard and they have the big pool and have all the play equipment. They're the others who live in an apartment situation that don't have the same access. So it's not an even playing field as such. We now know that the pandemic has really widened the gap between leading and lagging countries, the rich and poor nations, but also health inequalities globally and locally. So lower socioeconomic areas around Australia, as we've seen, especially during the Sydney and Melbourne extended lockdown periods, as we will discuss in the symposium coming up, have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic response measures. So Australia really prides itself on its Medicare system, but again, health is increasingly linked to wealth. So access is not necessarily always straightforward. And what we've also seen, as I pointed out before, is is benevolent discrimination, which is quite subtle, and it's a structural form of discrimination, but it's this assuming of knowing what people need and imposing that upon them. And it's imposed on some of us more than others. I love this campaign by the World Health Organization, which very much talked about the whole idea that viruses don't discriminate. They can catch anyone, anywhere. That's true, but our social structures do discriminate. Some people have a much better chance to adhere to public health measures or to isolate themselves than others do. What we've effectively done in a lot of our responses, which again have been very much had to be on the spot, is to ignore some of those sociocultural differences. And that's especially pointing the finger at the media reporting, which is very much looking at the us versus them. And it's purely focusing on language, or rather translation, as a core culprit in strategy, rather than recognizing that there is much more to separating multicultural and different communities from another. So what I'm arguing really is that we need to look beyond language issues to recognize underlying challenges. As I mentioned before, those larger households, those people who rely on being able to work in the gig economy, who can't afford to stay at home. But also, I was absolutely petrified when the first news came out of people dying at home without even being diagnosed. And the media is quite quick to point a finger at people for not following instructions and getting tested. But the reality is why are people not getting tested? Is it because they don't have access? Is it because people can't afford to distance at home? Is it because they can't afford for other family members not being able to go to work? So we have to ask those bigger questions really to understand, rather than to very quickly point the finger. And I'm someone who's always following with a lot of interest in the discussion threads and in news articles and so on. And I think that brings out quite often the worst of a society, but it's also quite fascinating and insightful. And I think we've lost a lot of tolerance over the last couple of years. As I mentioned before, we're going to look at Melbourne and Sydney as part of the symposium this afternoon. So therefore, I thought I'll have a look at Western Australia. So in Western Australia, where I'm based, is very proudly multicultural, very different multicultural compared to other part of the country. But this is taken from both health websites talking about multiculturalism being part of our identity. The state is proclaiming that it's home to the largest proportion of people born overseas, making it the most culturally diverse state in the nation, with people from 190 countries speaking more than 270 languages and dialects, including 50 Aboriginal languages. Hence, there is that need to provide culturally appropriate support services and care. However, these culturally appropriate services often don't stretch beyond translated version of government documents. And we've seen these associated issues that come with that over the last 22 months. First of all, during the first wave of lockdowns, we've seen a widespread of criticism of poorly translated documents that apparently made no sense in many of the respective languages. At least that was reported in the media as such, and there were lots of examples. And this has then prompted a more thorough approach to translations and sign-off measures, which have resulted in a lot of red tape and delays, to the effect that multicultural and multilingual communities that were relying on these translations were effectively being provided with outdated information. This was particularly relevant when health advice in relation to access to various vaccines was changed. And we've therefore come all to realise that during a pandemic, the ground is constantly shifting. Information moves so fast. We can't actually rely on something to be 4 weeks delayed, but then everything has changed and shifted. So it's disadvantaging those people relying on those translations. I don't have any quick answers to this, but it is an issue. However, most importantly, the reliance on translated documents available via respective health department websites really ignores the fact that in reality, this website may be not the first point of call for information. Humans are social, we talk to like-minded people, we trust our community leaders, friends, family. We have different preferences in terms of communication channels, including social media platforms. And in reality, as important as these official channels are, they are not necessarily the first place we go to for information. So it's that information vacuum as well that's very quickly being followed. Coming back to the whole idea of isolating yourself, I mean, WA has been very unique in that way because the state has effectively become an island within an island. It's been completely cut off from the rest of the world for most of the past 22 months and the rest of Australia effectively as well. And the overarching framing by the state government and the media is life is good, life is awesome. So we don't actually need to speak about health measures with a sense of urgency. And therefore, COVID-related communication is very much based on a one-size-fits-all approach. Everything is good, roll up for WA, come along. We've very much relied for a long time on mass vaccination centres. And what this ignores is that those multicultural hotspots actually need targeted communication. It's only happening now in some areas. And we're only really seeing now more community-based approaches to vaccines and vaccinations, which is really interesting. When I speak to colleagues in New Zealand, they've got their own issues, don't get me wrong, but they started quite early with family rooms for vaccinations, where you can go in as a kind of whole family group. They've engaged a lot of the multicultural communities locally as well and made vaccines available at a local level. Again, they've got their own issues. On the screen, you see the two references to health and multicultural communities that I could really find within this context in WA, and they're basically telling health professionals all about the services and the need for competencies, but there is that lack of engagement between departments and the multicultural communities. And I should really emphasise that we've got a Multicultural Communities Council of WA, and they are very proactive, but they're registered charities, so they're doing their own thing and trying to inform decision making. I also really like to point out that I'm not pointing the finger at anyone at all. I know that public servants are trying to do their very best to deal with the ever-shifting environment, and we've got some of our brightest students working in that space. It is a tricky environment to be in. So what do we need going forward, preparing for the next pandemic? Hopefully, when we've had the benefit of hindsight and we're able to prepare a little bit more. Well, I think we need to stop telling people what to do. We actually need to start listening, and that's about actual meaningful listening to understand underlying complexities. And that goes beyond just consulting in words with community leaders, but actually listening to what they've got to say, what the concerns are, what the challenges are locally, and looking beyond just those translations and spoken language, but to really collectively participate in the problem-solving process. We need that real consultation as opposed to consultation in name only. And most importantly, I believe we need to give those multilingual communities a voice as opposed to just words. I've got just some final thoughts and then I wrap up. But basically, multilingual communities need to be involved beyond those words. And as I said before, I'm not pointing the finger at everyone. I know everyone is trying their utmost to get to deal with the constantly changing environment, which makes it extremely difficult dealing with you not knowing what's just immediately ahead. But I do strongly believe that there's a need for Australia and other countries really to embrace multiculturalism as a real asset, to not just look at the English language as kind of the common denominator, but to recognise that multilingualism with itself brings multiple perspectives, multiple experiences, interpretation. There is so much research that shows how our brain thinks in a very different way, and it's wired differently depending on which language we speak. And I can certainly relate to that. So we could actually harness that benefit and that level of creativity and problem solving more effectively. We need to look beyond the framing of different languages. It's difficult and challenging and a problem. We need to celebrate those languages more effectively. And there's really that need to empower multicultural and lingual communities and be part of that solution. So that's basically it for me. I've got some references there, but I'm quite happy to go back to this and have a bit of a chat and a conversation to hear what you're thinking.
Thanks so much, Katarina. That was really excellent. Great background to the symposium that's coming as well. So I'd love to open up for questions now. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to just put up your hand or or put a comment in the chat box, and I can call on you. You're able to just turn on your mic and speak if you'd like to do that. So I'm just going to go to gallery view now and see if anyone is putting up their hand. No questions just yet. Well, I might start with one. Oh, no, Phil?
No, not at the moment. You go ahead.
Well, this is something that we will be going into a bit more in the symposium as well. But I'm wondering if maybe, well, I guess the first thing is, given that there are so many different languages and there is limited funding, what are your thoughts about how governments, how they should prioritise their funding in terms of engaging with communities, across different language groups?
I believe what we've really failed to understand, and I do understand why governments might see it as particularly risky to go down that route, but I would say community influencers. I would certainly engage more with communities and community leaders. And when I say influencers, I'm not necessarily talking social media influencers. That's an entirely different area, but there could be some crossovers. But those community voices that are extremely trusted, looked up to, people in the local communities that people will go to, talk to, engage with. And we actually seen, and I should have mentioned it, some of the best engagement we've seen throughout the pandemic is really through our Aboriginal services and health services, and where we see now a huge uptake there. We've got some communities which have a huge vaccination uptake, and that's because we've got people on the ground working with local leaders to combat any mis and disinformation and to really engage with people where it matters, rather than say, look, here's a poster. It's that loss of control, which is quite often a big concern, especially to governments. And that's why I can see that advertising is far more attractive. But the reality is those conversations happen anyway, if you're part of it or not. So if you can actually distribute that power and involve people more broadly, you've got a far better chance to actually get through.
Great, thanks, Katarina. Are there any particular examples that are standouts there in terms of communities doing a good job?
Yeah, look, we've got some communities, especially in the far north Kimberley, that have done that in terms of door knocking, in terms of Aboriginal health services, also in the way in which they've adapted very early infographics and changed the wording, the representation. I mean, the government campaign with the little blobs that are hopping around, it was quite simplistic, but and the idea was probably to make it very simple so people can understand it, after an initial focus on lots and lots of words. But the question is how many people did actually engage with that federal campaign that at times kind of just popped up and then disappeared again. So it's that contextualizing that I find is really important. What we see now more locally is the involvement of say local sports stars and people who do have a lot of clout within their community, and they don't need to be the top players in the club, but people who are recognized locally and can go back to their range of communities to actually have those honest conversations.
Thanks. Alice, you've got a question?
Well, no, I just got a comment. I absolutely agree with you. This is a fantastic presentation. Thank you for mentioning that, particularly raising the questions about treating multiculturalism, multilingualism as an asset. And in New South Wales, for example, it is actually very, very interesting to see that the government engage with the community language sector extensively to trying to say that, like, okay, so here we got about 30 30,000 students, and that's 30,000 family that we can reach out to through the community language network to support the vaccination, to support information for COVID and preventions and everything. I think the problem is also about timing. Is to think about, like, for example, the engagement with the community language sectors also has to be run parallel to engaging with community leaders there. So that could be slightly different groups, not necessarily the same group of people. And so we're looking at, for example, Multicultural New South Wales is stretched to the limit, almost literally. It's basically, you see those people running a forum meetings every other day on that one. But it's quite interesting to see, to think about maybe. I mean, I'm slightly not very optimistic, because when we hear the news that in 2024 we will be producing vaccine, I'm thinking like, okay, we're still going to be going through this in 2024, possibly. That's quite scary. But we'll have to rethink about the schedules of thinking who to engage, and it's also a changing landscape of who those people are, the community leader, because that's also could be a very challenging conversation of like, oh, you're talking to him but not her. And that kind of conversation, particularly in some of the communities that talk about like more gender-oriented reach out from the government. And so it's actually kind of really complex and could possibly be very challenging conversations as well. But thank you for raising that. It's really, really important.
I fully agree with you, Alice. It is a bit of a minefield, isn't it? Because you want to get the people right and you can't get them right quickly. So first of all, you need to have that established trust, because you can't just all of a sudden walk in and expect people to listen to you. And depending on different cultures, that takes quite a period of time. But that's why I'm also quite concerned about trying to limit quite often. I know Multicultural New South Wales is doing some amazing stuff. I mean, we're looking at multicultural health being a designated kind of area, whilst in any other state or territory, you've kind of got like a little tag on the existing website. The challenge I see there is that trust quite often is limited in regards to governments and government departments, and it's been framed in the media very much around, and some politicians have repeated that, and it's got to do with people's background, because the countries they're coming from, they might have had some really poor experiences and quite challenging experiences with government. I'd say, well, most of us would have had some challenging experience with government departments, irrespective of the country, and that's because of research limitations. So that's a level of trust, but that also means that that's not necessarily where we go to for information. But yeah, that complexity, it's huge, and it means you cannot move fast. That's very true.
Phil?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on what Alice said about the community language schools and the role of the community language schools, because I'm no doubt at all that they played a very positive role in communicating with communities, and they deserve a lot of credit for that. But I'm actually not quite sure what to think about it, because at that time, as you probably know, the context was really that this whole area of Southwest Sydney had been locked down and had been targeted as the sort of, I mean, that was the foreigner within almost, wasn't it? I mean, we kind of locked down this area where all the foreigners were, and in the hope of containing the virus somehow. And what you were seeing on the news was all these case studies of, so some family had a party and they'd all got it, and oh my God, the message is just not getting through, that these people are not listening. So the whole discourse was framed as, it was spreading in Southwest Sydney because people were not listening, because they weren't getting the message, and so on. And so after the events, then the community language schools, they got a lot of praise from Multicultural New South Wales, who kind of organized that. and even from our former Premier, Gladys Berejiklian, who was actually a great supporter of community language schools. So there was all that praise came, but it's just, I mean, what I feel a little uncomfortable in my mind is, first of all, is that the community language schools, this is not really their job. Their job is to teach community language schools to people who, they're trying to stop people from shifting over to English. They're actually trying to encourage people. It's not their job to sort of communicate with people who don't speak English. That's actually quite a radical reconception of their roles in a way. Although of course they can do that. They have the capacity to do that. And the other thing that I felt a little bit uncomfortable about was just that there was this idea that, you know, there was this barrier that we can't get across. You know, we need the community organizations to get across this barrier, when actually they had put up the barrier, you know, by locking the area down. They'd created that barrier. And suddenly there was this kind of idea that, you know, how fantastic it was that the community language schools helped us to sort of cross this kind of barrier that in a way doesn't really exist. And so I guess, sorry, I'm taking a long time to say that, but I'm just a little worried that we could also slip into this discourse where, you know, the problem of communicating with multicultural communities is their languages. And I'm not sure that that really is the problem, because it's, you know, the issue of whether people do speak English well or not is all tied up with all kinds of sort of social class and other issues, and residential issues and so on. Anyway, I just wonder what if you have any thoughts about that.
I entirely agree with you, Phil. I find this quite fascinating, because the way it's been framed is these people just don't speak English well enough. They don't understand what they're supposed to do. And so it comes with the assumption that not speaking English makes you somehow less educated and somehow less able to follow instructions, to comprehend instructions, which is a ridiculous premise. What it also does is it's kind of completely ignore, as you said before, a lot of these people do speak fluent English or well enough English to fully understand what's going on. It's got to do with the framing, and it's not that people have parties because they don't understand, they're not supposed to, but it's got to do with those parties being singled out, as opposed to the parties on the east or in the eastern suburbs that don't get a mention because they're hidden away somewhere, don't know, in a private mansion, so people can't see them. They don't have the police on the street, versus those that might be in an apartment block where it's quite visible. So the whole narrowing down the whole conversation and the complexity of it down to English language skills is way too simplistic. And that's where we really look at blame shifting. I fully agree with you.
Thank you. I can see, Mandy, you've got your hand up, but before we go there, I see we've got a question from Lenny. Just wondering if you wanted to share your question verbally, Lenny from New Zealand.
Hi, so I'm just going to read what I've posted earlier. So I'm based in New Zealand right now, and interestingly, the data, vaccination data show that the Asian community here were the first group to, to show vaccine compliance compared to the Pakejas and all the other European descents. So certainly we do have problems here, and a lot has to be done for the Maori community. So I'm wondering if, when you said othering, if that tended to be more for the migrants or for the Indigenous people in Australia.
I find your comments very interesting, because I wasn't aware that it was the Asian community that's currently the most compliant. See, I wasn't across that data, but I was aware that the Maori community is creating huge concerns in terms of, I know they had a lot of localized vaccination centers, but getting people actually to come along has been a big issue there. In terms of othering here, within this current context, it's really looking at the migrant community. And I'm aware of a lot of research that's been done, especially looking at the othering specifically of Asian communities within the context of COVID. This whole idea of it has come out of Asia, therefore, anyone who remotely looks like they might have, and in relation to, don't know, Asian descendants is to blame for what's been happening. And I've read some really interesting, like recent HDR studies that have been done in that space as well. So for us, it's really been mainly the migrant community. The Aboriginal community has been treated quite differently, and certainly in Western Australia, a lot of the communities are still completely locked down. So the really remote communities haven't actually opened yet at all. They're trying to keep everyone out and prepare themselves slowly for the reopening. But yeah, thank you for sharing those, those insights. That's great.
Yeah, thank you. So that's one difference there in terms of, yes, compliance. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lenny. And now to Mandy.
And I've actually got a video today, so that's good. I'm on my home computer. I had a very strange sort of logo yesterday. I just wanted to add to the conversation about how to get the message out to communities. And I take Phil's point that community language schools teach languages, but in fact, they do a lot more than that. They are run by the community, so they really do have excellent links to the communities. But one of the findings of a couple of recent reviews have been that they are a very good way to link the communities up with mainstream, because they're realizing they're not just teaching kids the language of somewhere where their parents came from, or perhaps where they were born, but they are helping develop fully, you know, bicultural, multilingual Australians, because these kids are, most of the hours of the day are spent either with their families or with mainstream schools and their friends there. So it is logical in a pandemic or an emergency to use all the possible ways of going. And so it's not, you know, their core value, but I think we were all called on to do things that are not our core value. But they shouldn't be underestimated, I think, as a link to the community. And even if people are fluent in English, they're not necessarily looking at these mainstream channels where the information is. So you could even tell them where it is. But I must say that some of the English stuff that I saw was completely incomprehensible. And I had to prepare it for, I'm involved in a bilingual community radio broadcast. And so my colleague does stuff in Chinese, but I had to translate the English into English before giving it to her to translate so that she gave it in Chinese. It was all far too complicated. I thought, what on earth are they trying to say? So simple English is a good way to go too in giving information.
Could I just come back, because I'm aware that my that what I was commenting could be taken as criticism of the language schools, and I absolutely agree with you, Mandy, that they have a bigger function than simply teaching languages. I think the point, and possibly I didn't put that very well, but the point I was making really is how that was situated within a sort of discourse where it was the language, where language was actually the big problem there in getting the message across. And I think, I mean, I know that the community schools did a fantastic job in helping out there, and sure, everybody has to do more, but why not give them a bit more money, you know? We'll give them a bit more government funding, you know, if they do have because they're only actually funded per head of student who is actually learning a language. So in a sense, their funded function is only to teach languages, but as you say, they have a much bigger funding, much bigger function than that. I agree.
A thumbs up from Antonio around a funding point, I guess.
I think Alice makes a very important point there about kind of shifting the responsibility. That certainly is a challenge there. If you're saying, well, that's your language, your community, you deal with it. It's that kind of lack of a consolidated effort and the whole understanding of it being a collaborative effort working together. It's that fragmentation of society really that we're seeing increasingly. But coming back to Mandy's comments, the whole idea of a community school, which is great, because when you speak to a lot of earlier migrants, second generation migrants, I've spoken to a lot of people who were never taught their language, and they really wanted to, people my age, people younger than me, and it's only now that it's actually becoming more of the norm. So I'm hoping that we see a bit of a shift in Australia where we're starting to embrace other languages beyond the usual, Italian at primary school, which I'm certainly seeing, but that kind of whole mix and really encouraging multilingualism and beyond.
Great. Do we have any further questions? In that case, I will move to a plug for our next session, which kind of continues the conversation. So you can continue to hang on, and Katarina will be around to answer any further questions, or we can have a break. You can go for a break and come back at 2:15, I think. But just to say that our next session is also on the topic more. So it's also on the topic of beyond translation, so the multicultural community engagement and inclusive communication during the COVID-19 pandemic. So we have, we'll be joined by Marianne Sisson, who will be talking about the Victorian case study, as well as Som Sengmani from Deakin University. Marianne's from RMIT. They'll both be talking about the Victorian case, and Katharina, myself, Tanya Muscat, and Sarah Ackbeck will be talking about the New South Wales case. And after the break, we have Evelina Elsmore, who will be discussing multicultural audience engagement in the arts sector, as well as part of that symposium. So we'd love you to join us there. In the meantime, I'll thank Katarina very much for that very enlightening plenary speech presentation. Yeah, thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you in the next session. If you have any further questions, don't hesitate to hang on and ask informally now.
Thanks, Lauren.
Could I just jump in if we have a second? I want to thank Katarina also, and also Lauren, for helping to set this up and set the symposium up, because this is exactly what we're trying to do in our Multilingualism Research Centre, is get over the idea that like linguists are only interested in language, and linguists are the only people who are interested in language. So this kind of cross-disciplinary conversation has been fantastic. And so I want to thank Katarina for that, and Lauren for helping us to set the whole thing up.
You're welcome.
And thank you for having me here. It's been fascinating, and I'm looking forward to joining some more sessions over the course of the conference.